Lake Effect brings you conversations about what's happening in Milwaukee and the people, places, and organizations that shape our community. This is Lake Effect Spotlight from WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.
Earlier this summer, an invasive species called Japanese Stiltgrass was spotted in Rock County. Scientists are now asking the public to help prevent the invasive grass from spreading across the state. Mark Renz is a professor and an extension weed specialist at UW-Madison. He joins Lake Effect's Xcaret Nuñez to share how to identify stiltgrass and what to do if you find it.
What's the recent status update on confirmed cases of the invasive species Japanese stiltgrass?
We had an initial report in one property just east of Beloit, and since then we've kind of created an alert and asked woodland and forestry owners and people that just frequent these areas to be on the lookout for this invasive annual grass called Japanese stiltgrass. We've gotten many reports. 2 of those have turned out to be positive reports of new infestations, one in the southwest part of the state and one in the southeast part of the state. So that's the bad news, but it's actually good news because these populations were only like 30 by 30 square feet. And so those property owners should be easily able to eradicate those populations before they spread further. And really, they were found before they really were causing any impact whatsoever in those forests.
Well, that's good to hear that it was caught before it was, spreading everywhere. For folks who have never heard of stiltgrass, why is this particular invasive grass a problem? How does it damage forests?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting scenario. So I like to use the analogy that this is very similar in many ways to crabgrass in your lawn. It's an annual grass that grows from seed every year and dies. But what's unique about this plant is it can grow in shaded environments and shaded conditions underneath forests and on edges of forests. And it produces a lot more biomass, and that biomass tends to climb on top of other vegetation and suppress it and dominate the understory. So you get mats of this annual grass. So we have data that clearly shows that the understory native plants and wildlife are impacted by having this new species that's not native to our system. But what's even more scary is that biomass that sits there, that mat of annual grass, dries out over winter, and it changes fire frequency, or more importantly, fire intensity. And so it can really cause some dramatic shifts in that ecosystem, potentially cause additional harm to nearby urban environments if it's invaded. And it even changes some of the stuff that's happening below ground and the nutrient relationships. So it's just really impactful. This has been present in southern part of the U.S. for decades, so we've kind of been on the alert for it for many years. But the best way to prevent this impact is to identify it right when it establishes and get rid of it before it spreads. And so that's kind of why we've been trying to promote that people look for this plant.
So just to clarify, it's new to Wisconsin, this invasive species, but it's been a big problem for other states for a while.
Correct. It's been in northern Illinois for several years. We got our first known infestation in the county of La Crosse in 2020, and that's being actively eradicated and is nearly eradicated by the Wisconsin DNR. So we thought we were stiltgrass free until this new report came in this summer. And that's when we started to alert people to keep a lookout.
Well, walk me through what stiltgrass looks like and some of the characteristics that people can identify it by.
I will walk you through this, but I want to say, first off, if you're not a plant expert, this is, difficulty 11 out of a scale of 1 to 10. So it's really a hard plant to identify because all grasses look alike, and even trained botanists can struggle with this. I'll preface this by saying you really should look at some of our resources to help you with identification. We have videos and fact sheets. But essentially what you're looking for is a low-growing grass that has a relatively short leaf, and that leaf has a very distinct midrib that's white in the middle of it. And this grass, if it gets big enough, can actually grow on top of other vegetation, kind of like a vine. If you look at the base of that annual grass, you will see roots that come out at nodes near the ground but above the ground. And those are kind of look like stilts, and that's where it gets its name, Japanese stiltgrass.
And I understand that it also flowers. What does it look like when it flowers?
Yeah, I mean, so again, if you're not a trained botanist, it'll just look like any other grass. It actually is rather similar to crabgrass, but does have some unique characteristics. So it does not have a showy flower like we typically think of it. It more has a grass-like flower because it's wind pollinated. And actually, what makes this plant so aggressive, it produces flowers that don't need to be pollinated to produce seed. So it has a special type of flowers that it can produce that allows it to rapidly produce seeds. And so that's our goal with management. If we can prevent seed production, we can win this battle. And so when we're managing it, that's our goal. The good news is we're far enough north that it doesn't start to produce seed until middle of September. So we can still detect things now, get rid of it before seed is produced, and protect our forest from further spread.
So what I'm understanding is that Japanese stiltgrass is an annual invasive grass, not a perennial, and it dies in the fall and reproduces by seed. And that's how it grows again and again every year.
Correct.
Okay. So can this invasive species still be managed or removed after it flowers?
Yeah, so after it flowers, or when it is in the process of flowering, our techniques change. And we're usually using techniques where we're trying to collect the flowers so the seed doesn't go back into the soil. Once that seed's in the soil, we've lost that round of the battle. But usually what we're trying to do is that then we're going to alter our tactics and try to encourage that seed to germinate. And then when it germinates, we want to actively control it before it produces flowers and seeds the next year. And the good news is the seed does not persist very long in the soil. So some seeds can persist for over 20 years in the soil. Research has shown anywhere from 2 to 3 years is the seed longevity. So if you have an invaded forest, if you prevent seed production for 3 consecutive years, you should eradicate that population as long as no seed is coming into that environment from outside sources.
So as we've been talking about, when an invasive species is introduced to Wisconsin, do you look at how it got here?
Yeah, I mean, it's really important to try and understand how it arrives. It's an easy question to ask, Xcaret. Unfortunately, it's really hard to find the solution in many cases. And this is an example of this. We just showed up at this woodlot. We were told, we went there, this plant is there, and we have no idea how it got there. So we can come up with some guesses. Since this is spread by seeds, our guess is that some equipment or an individual came in with contaminated soil on their boots or on a piece of equipment like a tractor, and they did some work there. That seed got deposited and was allowed to take off and expand. So that's likely what happened, but in many cases, it can be almost impossible to figure that out. But that's important if we can, because then we can understand how to prevent future invasions.
Right. I was going to follow up with that with asking you, like, what are some ways that people can just help prevent any spread of invasive species?
There's 2 pieces of advice that are like really, really simple ones. Number 1, learn how to identify some of the common invasive species that are in areas that you visit, because knowledge of where they are will then make you aware of how they spread. And then the other probably more important thing is whenever you go to a site, when you're getting ready to leave that site, just take a moment to clean off any mud or debris on yourself, your vehicle, or your equipment before going to another location. Because what we find is 90+% of the time, it's accidental spread of these populations, not knowingly because it was contaminated in something else that was delivered. So those are probably the 2 easiest things to do. Again, easy to say, but if you're out, in a muddy field and you have mud all over your car, that can be a hard thing to do sometimes. But I would urge listeners to think about that, particularly when they're going to an area that is not invaded or heavily invaded, when you previously were visiting an area that did have a lot of invasives.
Right. Just changing a little bit of those habits, that mindset. I'm Lake Effect's Xcaret Nuñez speaking with Mark Renz about preventing the spread of Japanese stiltgrass. So earlier you mentioned the type of environment this invasive species thrives in. Is it limited to forest lands, or can people find this in their backyards too?
So they potentially could. So this plant is really unique and it's really well adapted to partial shade to full shade. So it does really, really well on edges of fields. In this one property in particular, it has some lawn areas that were mowed and it's well established within the lawn and is doing well because of the partial sun. So again, kind of like crabgrass. I don't think it's going to be a problem in full sun environments, but any partial sun environments, it could be a problem. I think it's the impacts are probably less in an urban setting, like say someone's backyard versus a forest, which we're trying to maintain in more of a natural system. But it could definitely get established and be a problem in those areas.
So if someone thinks they spot Japanese stiltgrass, what should they do?
Yeah, I think there's like 3 or 4 things to do. First is stop, take a picture of it, and send it to someone who's an expert that can confirm its identification. I think that's probably the most important thing that they can do. And it can be someone in extension, someone with Wisconsin DNR, or even someone locally that can get it to one of us. Then the other thing to do is if you are on that property and you do think you have it, make sure you clean your equipment and yourself off before leaving that site so you're not spreading that site. Those are probably the top 2 things to do. What will happen if it is a positive response? You will get confirmation of that response, and then we will work with the landowner or the individual to develop a management plan so they can manage that plant. I want to emphasize that this is a prohibited plant in Wisconsin. So by law, it is a requirement that the landowner control this, or DNR has the authority to go in and control it and send them the bill. But DNR has been really good at trying to work with the landowner to try to mitigate this in a positive way and not be as forceful. So we're just trying to get the word out and make sure that people can get a handle on this. It sounds like we're seeing a new wave of invasion. We'll probably see more. So we're developing some tools to really prevent the impact of this species. That's really our goal.
Absolutely. And if someone does come across it, or they think they do, and they try to deroot the plant, how should they dispose of it?
Great question. So in Wisconsin, what you can do is if you want to hand pull or pull up the plant, it is an annual plant, so you probably don't even need to get all the roots to kill the plant. But what I would recommend is if that plant has no flowers or anything that looks similar to flowers, I would just leave it on the side of the trail, because without producing seed, that's not a chance. If it's close to now where it looks like it might be able to produce flowers and then seed, what you can do is put it in a bag, and then by Wisconsin law, you are able to put that in the trash and label that bag invasive plant, and it will go to a landfill, and a landfill actively manages it so it won't be a problem.
Well, before we wrap up, you mentioned earlier that the first case of Japanese stiltgrass was confirmed in 2020. What's the status on eradicating that?
Yeah, so that was discovered by a botanist from another state that was familiar with this. Once that was discovered, there was some active surveying that went on by DNR, and now they're actively managing it. They've been managing it for 3 years. This is their 4th year. There were some challenges in the first steps on how to figure out the best approach, but every year they're seeing less and less plants. And so we're optimistic that that population is going to be eradicated soon.
And where can people go to find out more information about Japanese stiltgrass and other invasive species?
We actively create a lot of educational material slated at invasive plant identification as well as management. So we have several resources that you can find on our website, renzweedscience at cals.wisc.edu. We also have a group called Wisconsin's First Detectors Network. That's a group of community scientists that are trained, and then in lieu of the training, we ask that they go out and actively look for invasive species and submit observations. And so those are 2 good resources that are free that they can educate themselves on invasive species, how to identify them, how to manage them, what the impacts are. and even learn a little bit about our research that we're doing on them.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for speaking with me today. I appreciate you sharing this information on stiltgrass.
Great. Pleasure to communicate the information and happy to help.
Mark Renz is an extension weed specialist and a professor in the Department of Plant and Agroecosystem Sciences at UW-Madison. He spoke with Lake Effect's Xcaret Nuñez.
You can find more interviews like this one by visiting wuwm.com/lakeeffect. And while you're there, subscribe to the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast.